To give you some idea of the test-driven development flow, I'm going to jump right into Visual Studio. If you remember in the first module of this course, I set up an ode-to-food.tests class library project for unit testing. The project uses the popular NUnit framework for testing. That's an open source tool, and we installed it using NuGet. It was easy and painless. Once you install NUnit, then inside of the NuGet packages folder, which you will find at the solution level, where your solution file exists, you'll find the NUnit directory, and inside of there will be a tools directory, and from here you can launch the NUnit GUI tool that allows you to point and click to run tests. NUnit is already pointed to ode-to-food.tests.dll, but it's a little bit unhappy right now just because there are no tests inside of the project. However, I do have a placeholder file here where I want to write some tests and use TDD to drive out some functionality I just thought of. What I want to do is have the software compute the overall rating of a restaurant, and I spent some time writing down some comments and thoughts in this test file to describe how I want the rating calculated, because the site might want to experiment with a couple different techniques. One approach would be to just take the simple average of all the restaurant's associated reviews. Or perhaps we only want to take an average of the last n number of reviews, where n is something an administrator can configure. So for instance, the last 10 reviews or the last 100 reviews. Another approach would be to compute a weighted mean, where the most recent reviews are more heavily weighted. This might benefit a restaurant that is improving after a bad start and getting better reviews. It might also benefit a customer who is thinking about going to a restaurant that used to have great quality but is now on the decline. And I've written these out as comments inside of my test file just so I can refer to them and think about them. Many times if I talk to a client or a business owner and I have a conversation with them and I need to go back and implement a feature, I'll write down as a comment inside the unit test file things and notes that I picked up from that conversation. I can delete the comments when I'm done, but for right now it provides me something concrete that I can look at. And then I can start thinking about a solution and thinking about how I would implement this feature using TDD. To get started, I'm going to create a test fixture. A test fixture is a class that's going to hold test methods inside of it. You might get hung up on trying to name this class. I'm just going to call it test class for now. Once we've identified the types of test methods that we have inside of here, we can come back and give it a better name. And let me add the first test, which I'm just going to call test1 for now. Again, don't get too hung up on naming at first. My idea is that I want to use Visual Studio like I would use a whiteboard in the old days. So someone would give me a software requirement and I'd start trying to diagram out some classes and what the methods would look like. I'm going to do that in Visual Studio instead of a whiteboard, because Visual Studio gives me a compiler, and I can use something like unit test to validate some of my assumptions. And so for the first step, I know I'm going to be working with data that's going to involve some sort of restaurant information. We already have that class available. And my restaurant has some reviews that I'm going to create. And let me go ahead and add a review. And all we really care about for the purposes of this test, I think, is the fact that the review has a rating, like a 4. That's the data I want to evaluate. And now I can start thinking about the API that I want to use to compute the restaurant rating, the overall restaurant rating. And I'm just going to guess right now. Let's say that I have a restaurant rater that I pass this data into. And of course, this code doesn't compile, but I don't expect it to yet. Remember, this is just a whiteboard. In fact, one of the first steps that you'll take a lot of times with test-driven development is writing some code that's not going to compile, and then you go and do the simplest possible thing just to get it to compile. And let me imagine that this rater, if I tell it to compute some sort of overall rate, given, let's say, the first 10 reviews, then it will give me back some sort of result. This is a time when I can explore how I want to invoke APIs, how I want to invoke methods, what parameters do I want to pass, what do I want to name things. But let me forge ahead with what we have so far, and I'm thinking that if I tell it to compute the result for a restaurant with a single review, and we're just doing the simple averaging right now, I should be able to assert that 4 is the result.rating. And right now, if I try to do a build, it's going to fail miserably. So let's use Visual Studio to create these classes just so we can get to the point where we can compile. So I'm going to generate the class for Restaurant Rater. That's going to be put into a different file that's still in my unit testing project, and that's okay for right now. I'll just keep everything in this directory and work on it. At some point, the design will start to firm up and I can move these .cs files into the right project and then adjust the namespaces accordingly. But this is going to need a constructor that takes a restaurant. So let me go ahead and add a constructor. This constructor takes a restaurant, and we'll bring in the namespace that we need, and we'll worry about everything else later on. We're just trying to get this to compile. I'm going to need a method called compute overall rate. Right now it's going to throw an exception. That's okay, but I do want to go ahead and change this to be a public method. And let's say that the result's going to be encapsulated also in a specific class. So let's just call it rate result. We don't have to live with these names, remember. One of the benefits that we'll see with test-driven development is that we can come in, refactor, change the code, change the names, run our test, and make sure everything is still working. Let me go ahead and generate that class. Again, that's going to be in a file that's in this project, in a separate file. We'll leave that there. And that class is going to need a rating property, which I just added to it with Visual Studio. Let's say that that has to return an int. And now we've reached the point where I should be able to do a build. And if we come over into NUnit, it will automatically reload that assembly. I can click run, and of course we have an exception that was thrown during execution, so the test failed. But that's okay, that gives me a starting point, and I've started to gel with some of my names and so forth. Now I want to make this test pass, and I'm going to do the simplest possible thing I can think of to make that happen. Let's create a result, which is a new rate result. I'm going to set the result.rating equal to 4. I'm going to return that result. Let's do a quick build. Wait for NUnit to reload that assembly, and then run it, and you can see that the test is passed. You might look at this and say, this is ridiculous. You're hard-coding the computation just to make the test pass. However, stick with me on this. One of the tenets of doing test-driven development is that you're going to do the simplest possible thing to make a test pass. Then once you have a passing test, you can do some refactoring and then add some additional tests to drive out new features and changes in the implementation. So this might seem like I'm doing something really strange, but try this approach once and you might be amazed at the results. TDD has done more to change the way I build software than anything else I've done. Now so far I've written a failing test, I've made the test pass. The next step is the refactoring phase. This is my opportunity to change code and know that I didn't break anything if I still have a passing test. For instance, I'm looking at this incoming parameter p, and even though I'm not using it yet, it's bothering me that that is a single character. This really represents the number of reviews to use. And I can make changes like this, and of course that's not going to have any impact. But later we'll have some more substantial changes. I can make those changes, rerun my test, and make sure that I didn't break anything. So now that we've seen a basic test, let's accelerate things a bit and work through the rest of the design and implementation of this feature.